Hello, everyone. This is From Day One, and welcome to the webinar, How to Decode the 6 Key Indicators Impacting Workplace Culture. Please welcome Steve Koepp, From Day One's Chief Content Officer and co-founder. He will be introducing the session. Welcome, Steve.
Hi, everyone. I'm Steve Koepp. I'm the co-founder of From Day One. I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar today. It's titled, How to Decode the 6 Key Indicators Impacting Workplace Culture. First of all, we'd like to thank you for attending and participating in today's event. We'll be exploring how to identify and measure early signs that precede culture failures. Among them are disrespect, bias, and ethical mistakes. Workplace culture is the most important thing in keeping our employees front and center. The session today will give you a breakdown of ways to successfully implement that healthy culture in your companies. We'd like to thank our sponsor today, Emtrain. Emtrain allows you to benchmark your culture against the global community to identify issues before they become toxic problems that become compliance issues and destroy culture. Emtrain partners with industry experts and uses current events to teach on topics such as sexual harassment, unconscious bias, and ethics. Emtrain's innovative platform is used by more than 800 culture-focused companies such as Netflix, Yelp, Dolby, Pinterest, and others. Emtrain is a woman-owned and woman-led company. Before we launch our conversation, a few logistical items. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event using your registration email. You can watch for a written account of the conversation next week on our website at fromday1.co. At about 2:45, we'll have a Q&A session. So please start submitting your questions at around that time and using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Janine Yancey, who's the founder and CEO of Emtrain. She's a passionate advocate for healthy workplace cultures. Interviewing Janine will be our moderator, Lydia Dishman, who reports for Fast Company on tech and leadership and has written for CBS Money Watch, Fortune, and the New York Times, among others. Now over to you, Lydia.
Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you to From Day One for providing me yet another opportunity to do what I love to do, which is a live interview. Can never beat that. And thank you to all who are with us today and watching. Please know that I extend to everyone my very best wishes for continued good health. I know that these are challenging times, so I appreciate that everyone is with us today, and I'm watching the counter go up. And I think it's phenomenal that we have over 200 people with us right now. So hello, everyone. So as Steve said, I am Lydia Dishman. I'm a reporter and editor at Fast Company, and my beat has centered around workplace issues for about the last 7 years now. So I have been eagerly anticipating this discussion with Janine, who I had the privilege of interviewing several years ago for an article that I wrote in Fast Company when the Me Too movement was really gaining steam. And we are going to talk about different workplace issues, not just harassment. But I would like to give Janine an opportunity to tell us a little bit about why you founded the company. Steve already introduced and said what you do, but I think that everyone loves a founder story. So take it away, Janine.
Thanks, Lydia. And hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. One of my colleagues is calling this an enforced study hall for everyone. So I think in that spirit, like let's focus on this being a helpful, kind of valuable experience. And let me just kind of give you, as Lydia said, a little context or background on myself and why I started Emtrain. So started off as an employment lawyer, employment litigator, advisor, trainer, initially actually for the employee side, and then I realized I didn't quite have the temperament for that. So I switched over to a management side lawyer. No reason other than it was just a better suit for my personality. And what I found after some amount of time was, when I'd have a situation and the business executives would say, Janine, we've got this issue, we've got this claim, can you help us out? And I would dig. I'm really good at digging. I'd be talking to the IT director or the managers or this or that. And everyone would be like, oh yeah, that's a problem. That's always been a problem. And yet the HR leaders, the people leaders, the business executives never knew. So there was always, there always has been, at least my whole career, and there still is, a really big disconnect between what people know and do in the trenches vis-a-vis what the business leaders know, right? It's almost kind of like two realities. And for those of us who have been employment litigators, we see it firsthand, because when you dig and you start interviewing people in the trenches, you find out the real deal. And it is always so just kind of cliche that, like, let's say there's a concern about some bad actor, if you will. If you have like 1,000-person workforce, you'll have hundreds of people saying, oh yeah, oh sure, I've known for years that that person's a bad actor. And yet the business leaders never know. So I really started Emtrain to not only address compliance training, which was kind of the most obvious kind of solution, but do it in a way so that, you fix what I call the broken feedback loop. Like, we just need to get the information that people all know in the trenches up to the business leaders making decisions. So there you have it.
It's interesting that you're talking about how sometimes the top brass doesn't really quite know what's happening below. And I think that it's this particular time during the pandemic and having so many people working remotely, it's become even more evident how there is a disconnect between leadership and the rest of the workforce. And so, but I did want to ask you though, businesses that haven't completely shut down are maybe just starting to turn a corner after that initial panicky stage of how am I going to manage this distributed workforce? But the threat to everyone's health and livelihood is still very much top of mind. So where do we make space to talk about the nuances of workplace culture? And what do you think we should prioritize during this fraught time?
Yeah, so I would say that this time is going to be where we step up and become culture leaders or not. And here's what I mean by that. Rough times, and this is just the benefit of me having been through a couple cycles, right? The one lovely thing about getting older. Rough times are when you will see people's, respect meter either show up or not, and their ethics either show up or not, right? And so, you've got people that will show up and be heroes, like our medical community. So it's totally, selfless, trying to solve problems. But at the same time, you will see a pretty big demographic that's all me, myself, and I, to the detriment and to the harm of those around them. And that is kind of coupled with or combined with integrity and systems for making decisions, right? And so there will be, I'll just throw it down right now, my prediction. The next 12 months, we will hear about many, many stories of ethics problems, so financial misreporting, conflicts of interest galore. Because this is what happens when times get tough. And this is culture. So to me, culture is how we show up together, how we choose to talk to each other, to collaborate with each other, to make decisions, to work with each other. So when you say, how do we make a space right now to talk about culture, to me, that as I define culture, it's the most important thing, right? Because in past down cycles, businesses were able to kind of get away with internal decisions remaining internal, right? So if they weren't as strategic as possible, if they weren't as empathetic as possible, the whole world didn't know about it. This is really the first down cycle where in the age of social media, where as soon as you make a decision, you better think through as a business leader, as a people leader, that everyone else is going to be watching and criticizing your decision. And so, like, the illustration that just comes to my mind right now is, the very recent former, Navy secretary made the decision to fire the commander, right? That went out like that. And now we're all Monday morning quarterbacking that's basically an employment decision, Was that the right decision in these times? And that, I think, is an illustration and applicable to all of us. And I can't stress enough, this will be the first time in history that all of us as people leaders, as business leaders, are making these types of decisions in these tough times under a microscope. sorry, I don't want to be so alarmist, but I just think that people need to stop and realize that, because I started Emtrain in part because as a former employment litigator, I saw that the system we use for managing the workforce is a dysfunctional one. And I think we're in a new paradigm that is going to really showcase that it's a dysfunctional system.
I'm kind of two minds here. You know, certainly the commander of that got fired, and like you said, rightly so, we were Monday morning quarterbacking that decision. And then we've certainly had a lot of other examples where entire workforces were laid off on Zoom. You know, it can't always be helped. But then when you get the nuance of that, you start to see, was it done empathetically? Could it even have been done empathetically? More of what I'm concerned with here is the nuance. And in the last webinar that we had, one of our speakers really brought up a really interesting point, that initiatives like diversity and inclusion, for example, have never been more important when you have a distributed workforce. I think that it's easy in these times to sort of not really think about ethical behavior, especially because when you are working remotely, you kind of don't see really what everybody's doing. So I'm going to ask you again, just to push this point, why is it more important to talk about culture now?
So yes, very good. Thank you. So I think another point that people should be thinking about is, when you're all remote and you don't see each other and you're not coming into regular contact with each other, you have to spend more time, more effort, more intentionality to build those connections, to actually communicate in a way that you know that you're going to be communicating effectively. So, I was just going to compare it to, prior to this pandemic, where you have the opportunity to go have lunch with somebody, have some downtime and chit chat. That's building rapport, that's building trust, that's building connections. And when you have those types of connections, it helps you navigate, some tricky situations, which we all have to encounter, right? And now we're going into a time where we don't have those types of relationships right now, right? Because we're not spending time with each other. We're not investing in our relationships in that way. And so the counterbalance to that needs to be culture. As I'm thinking about it, it's, how do we communicate with each other? How do we collaborate with each other? So we need to be super intentional and very deliberate that, you mentioned diversity and inclusion, very intentional. Oh, am I including everyone that should be included in this call? In a Zoom meeting, do I have an effective process to make sure everyone is heard who needs to be heard in this meeting? I just have to be way more intentional, I think, in your actions.
I think it can often place the burden of responsibility on HR leaders, especially as the behaviors that happen within companies are becoming more transparent. So how do you suggest that we start measuring, diagnosing, to use your word, culture in a more proactive way?
So we started at Emtrain, and this is kind of my suggestion for how folks start thinking about it. We started with the premise that we experience at times bad culture outcomes, right? So we experience a lack of respect, which, down the spectrum can turn into harassment, a lack of inclusion and diversity, ethical mistakes. And so we started with the idea that let's take those outcomes and basically trace them backwards to the beginning behaviors that we know, and this is just based on years of experience as employment advisors, workplace advisors, seeing how things and situations play out. We know that these are kind of the pre-indicator behaviors that when they're at heightened levels and they combine with one or more, oh no, that's when you're going to start having a potential for an unhealthy outcome, right? And so that's what we did. And we kind of started as an educated hypothesis, if you will. And in the kind of experience of our flagship, online harassment program, which everyone has to take, which is kind of a nice thing because you get 100% participation. We just started basically decoding, if you will, these situations into, oh, here are some behaviors that kind of combine and lead into these bad situations, showing them via video scenes and asking people, what they think about them and if they've seen that type of behavior in their workplace. And so strongly agree, strongly disagree, so people would be answering. And we were able to see through that, wow, it really did prove out and was consistent with our hypothesis that because we started with an initial kind of cadre, if you will, of 125 different companies, and the companies where the employees rated them as the most healthy had the highest kind of scores in what we had identified as these pre-indicators, right? And conversely, the companies where the employees rated it as not so healthy overall in terms of, we were asking about respect. Again, the kind of pre-indicator behaviors were also at those unhealthy ranges. So I know this is kind of hypothetical. I could show you maybe a graph if that's helpful. We could talk about that, or.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you because, one of the things that I remember from when I interviewed you previously, we had talked about defining these terms. What does harassment mean? What does bias mean? Any of these particular things, maybe a lot of different people have a lot of different definitions for them. So how do you go about contextual?
So exactly right. So contextualizing. So let me just kind of share this because this might be helpful for folks. And I'm let's start with this. So this is just a graph showing, so on the concept of respect, right? Where that's, to me, the three pillars of any healthy workplace culture are respect, inclusion, and ethics. And everything else kind of amplifies and flows from there. But if you don't have those three main pillars, you really don't have anything, right? So this is really kind of decoding the issue of respect. And, I'm an employment lawyer. I can look at it as like the legal elements, but I don't think that that's very helpful. I mean, it's helpful to a degree, but for everyday people, like, let's just map it down to the behaviors, not the legal elements. I always say laws follow people. People, it's like you only get laws when you have enough people issues and crises that there's a need for a law. So, when we look at the actual behaviors that we're diagnosing and mapping to under kind of the broad topic of respect, you've got 3 organizational behaviors and 3 people behaviors, right? So on the organizational behaviors, you've got what we call in-out group dynamics. And it's no more fancy than, think back to the high school quad. You got the cool kids and the not so cool kids. And it could be anything, right? It's, it's not only around gender lines, around race lines, it's under political identity lines, which we found out, religion lines. It's all sorts of in-group and out-groups. And it's basically who's closer to the power source and who's marginalized. You've got power dynamics organizationally, and that's basically implications of power. So let me just kind of illustrate that real quickly. I can't tell you how many cases I had when I was an employment litigator. I was defending a really nice manager, typically, honestly, a white male manager who's accused of some wrongdoing, and a nice person, but who was really just kind of clueless that at the end of the day, that person's inviting a 25-year-old to have a glass of wine, and he's not really thinking anything of it. And the 25-year-old woman usually is thinking, oh gosh, I have to say yes. So that is what I would call implications of power. And they're just not thinking about that other person. That's super common, actually. And then behavioral norms and practices. So how well established is this organizational norms and practices? Like, regardless of your political identity and your management style, your communication style, does everyone map to a similar, kind of theme and style in that organization, right? And then just quickly on the people side, You know, so each of us comes with our own baggage to a workplace. And those are our unconscious biases, our social intelligence. We all know some of us are better at reading a room than others, better at reading nonverbal communication. Well, that's got some implications. And then our pre-existing mindset. So we're all the product of our former experiences. Some of us, you know, have had, you know, a certain set of experiences that are going to shape how we interact with people, right? So those are the three, I mean, the 6 indicators that we mapped out, and we showed videos, we asked questions, and basically surveyed people on how they you know, saw those indicators mapping in their organization.
2 things that come out of this for me. One is, it seems to be that you kind of cleverly put these different questions into the larger mandated compliance harassment training, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
So yeah, which is beautiful because it's 100% participation.
Right. Yeah, I caught that. But I just wanted to clarify. And then the other thing that you brought out, especially with that example of the 25-year-old who gets invited out, you know, with the executive, there's a certain level of power dynamic that allows people to feel like they have to say yes to something, even though it doesn't really feel right for them. And then there's that same level at work where they wouldn't necessarily report that. So my follow-up question to you is, how willing are people to really be honest to answer these questions that you're posing to them?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I love this because we message to everyone that this is anonymous for them. We de-identify the people responding with their answers, which is a key ingredient that I have always seen that's needed. Because to your point, Lydia, what we found is 64% of the people, so, you know, out of, when this report was captured and summarized, at that point, we had 2.5 million employee sentiment responses. So out of that 2.5 million, 64% said, we don't feel comfortable saying no to a boss. Like, and it's kind of, we all know that, right? Like when we stop to think about it, like, yeah, no duh. Only 17%.
64%. I would have thought it would actually have been higher, but it's still high.
Only 17% said that they would ever report a harassment situation if they saw it or experienced it. So less than 20%, which as an employment litigator, I knew that. And actually, as we're going to our HR stakeholders, they're frankly not that shocked either. But to actually have the real evidence, the real data, so that they can show their C-suite, like, hey, I'm not joking. This is really a thing, is super helpful. And so maybe, and I know you might have some other questions, but let me just kind of finish off this thought, because this might be helpful. Because what I think is super cool for everyone, because this is doable. Like we can do stuff on this. Is out of all 6 of these, the number one and most important component is this one here on the bottom of organizational norms and practices, right? So we found that so let me just stop here. Let's set the context. So out of 2.5 million employee responses, so the most healthy companies out of this whole benchmark, 75% of their workforce said, yes, my organization is healthy and it's respectful, right? And we're asking, showing videos, showing scenes, contextualizing it, and they said yes. The least healthy ones were down here at 30%, right? So some of the companies, their workforce said, no, not very healthy, right? But going back to my point, let's go here. Well, let's go here first. So a little over half of the whole data set employees said, we've got strong organizational norms and practices. And what we found was, this is super, super important, and it's totally doable. We can manage this. We can actually proactively create this. And what this does, it's basically the counterbalance to everyone's individual peccadillos, right? So if you've got managers that are not so helpful when it comes to power disparities and not understanding that, or unconscious biases, that's fine. They can bring them into the workplace, but if you have strong norms and practices, that's going to counterbalance all that, because it'd be like, this is how we do things here. And if you look at this my last slide here, just and then we could talk about it. This shows the healthiest companies, and up here to the right is the healthiest companies. And there's a huge disparity, a huge range, and the healthiest companies all show that their workforce says we have really strong norms and practices. The unhealthy companies are down here. And as a corollary, they have not very strong norms and practices.
Were the results ever a surprise to, I'm assuming that the HR leaders take it to the C-suite and discuss what's come out of it. So did anyone come back with any sort of shock and astonishment that things were not running as smoothly as they thought?
Yeah, so let me tell you about a tough conversation I had. So I went to the least healthy company as reported by the employees, their own employees, in a list that we had of 125. So first off, this is all confidential. When I talked to the most healthy company, I said, congratulations, you're the most healthy company out of 125, but I can never be public with this, because the nature of this only works if we're the antithesis to Glassdoor. Like, this only works if this is all completely safe and confidential, right? So moving to the least healthy company, I emailed the HR leader and I said, I need to chat with you about this, and this is not gonna be fun. Like, I just wanted her to kind of know, like, just chill, this is not gonna be a fun conversation. And when we actually got on the line, I showed her readout, her data report. Her reaction was, I'm not surprised. I am surprised at how pervasive this is. Like, it was a culture issue. It was a few execs that they just need strong coaching. They need someone to really talk to them, right? And their behavior, because of where they sit in the company, is just so far reaching, it's affecting the morale of everyone, like everyone. Close to 1,000 person company. And so she was surprised that it was that pervasive. And it was really kind of awkward, because she then says to me, and this is a very accomplished person, a CHRO, she's like, Janine, you're probably wondering why I'm still here. Like, she was embarrassed because of this report. And I'm like, no, I'm not wondering. You're fighting the good fight, basically. She goes, yeah, I feel like I can do some good here. And this report, I'm going to take it to the CEO, who's not one of the problem people. And this basically helps me communicate more effectively, saying, no, this really is an issue. And if we don't do something now, we're going to be in reactive mode, because something's going to happen.
Let me just take a beat here. I know that Steve wants to pop back on and give everyone a reminder.
Thanks, Lydia. Hi, everyone. I'd just like to remind anyone joining our webinar on midstream that we are from day one exploring how to decode the key indicators impacting workplace culture. Our sponsor is Emtrain, and this is fascinating stuff. So now back to you, Lydia and Janine.
And I just want to remind everyone to, if you do have any burning questions that I'm not asking, then feel free to drop them in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to them in about 10 or so minutes. But I want to go back to this piece of the puzzle that you're decoding for us here. So this wonderful HR leader fighting the good fight asks you to make recommendations, I'm guessing, based on the results of the report. And so this is a two-part question. So the first part of it is, what do recommendations like that look like?
Mm-hmm. So it really depends on where their vulnerability is, right? So for example, I'll get to her in particular organization in a second. Let me just talk about an easier one. Let's talk about the healthiest company, right? So they were the healthiest out of 125. Their scores were very strong. There was one area where they were actually below the global average, right? And that was in-group, out-group, where the political identity, and this is not surprising, as a society, we're experiencing this too, but this was a Bay Area tech company. And so there are 12,000 person workforce, and there are some people that are conservatives. And being a conservative in a Bay Area tech scene is difficult because you've got most of the in-group were all super progressive liberals, right? And so what was really interesting is you have a really strong, not vocal usually, demographic feeling ostracized, feeling alienated, right? And so we talked to them about that, and that's an easy, not easy, but it's a very direct, obvious, remedial plan. It's like you just need, it's a marketing communications internal plan. It's like, okay, let's have some lunch and learns. We're all neighbors here. We're all colleagues, and let's leave our politics, out the door. Let's not dehumanize people, because I think what we tend to do, especially in this polarized political, schema, is we just dehumanize everyone. So like, let's not do that. So those were our recommendations for the healthiest company. They had some stuff to work on. But going back to this other company that was challenged, it's like, okay, you've got some senior leaders that have, the higher up in the organization you are, the more impact and influence you have, right? So it's like, you got to get honest now. You need to have the CEO work with a change management group, basically, and support the evolution of these leaders. Let these leaders know the implications of their actions, right? So their unconscious biases, they have some unconscious biases, their power disparity, like almost zero social intelligence. There's so, and that's fine. You can work with anything. So if you have weak social intelligence skills, then it's just a matter of being more intentional about your communication. There's an answer or plan for whatever your weaknesses are. But we put together basically, just some recommendations so the CEO and the HR leader could follow up on that.
I'm glad you say that it seems like there's a fix for every ill here. I have to wonder, though, now that we are faced with working remotely, having distributed teams, and you add to that the challenge of people fearing for their health and for their livelihood, it makes people behave in ways that they wouldn't when they are in group settings, i.e. in the workplace. And it also makes people act out because they feel this sort of panicked lack of control. It's brain science. This is where we go for survival. So you poke a stick at me and I'm going to poke you right back. So how, very long-winded way of asking this question, how is there hope for handling these things remotely? And what does that look like? How different is it to address these workplace issues remotely?
I think that there's total hope. I think that there's a silver lining in every situation. And I think the silver lining for all of us people leaders or culture leaders in this tough situation is that it's going to just highlight not only the need to develop, I think of these things as workplace skills, right? So we've got our relationship skills, you get all types of skills, right? There is a set of skills that somebody who is a good addition to any team has, right? So your ability to be empathetic, your ability to switch your perspective and understand how somebody else is experiencing things, your ability to be inclusive, your ability to communicate. These are all skills that we have to build up, because if we don't build them up, then what happens is we have these, bad culture outcomes, right? So then looping back to your question, Lydia, it's about, it starts from the top. So the C-suite, as advised and supported by the culture leader, needs to intentionally say, this is what we're going to be doing as we are meeting with our team and our direct reports on Zoom every day. So A, it's going to be every day. B, we're going to check in I mean, we're just going to be very intentional and check in with people and get, you know, you know, some kind of understanding and connection of, are we okay? This is what the future holds for the next, and maybe the future is just the next 3 weeks. We don't know, but we're going to be honest. We're going to be transparent. We're going to be as supportive as we can as we all work together to navigate a tricky situation.
That slide that you showed us that was really helpful about the norms and the you know, there were big buckets. How refined do those buckets get when you are asking the questions of the workforce? I mean, how is it factoring in for very nuanced types of issues?
So a couple different ways. So first, we've got in just our harassment program. So all of our programs, we've basically implemented this concept of diagnostic questions, right? So you'll see a scene, and as you said, Lydia, earlier, and I think this is important to reference, your version of harassment is different than my version of harassment. Respect, you know, same thing. Bullying. We all have different images of what those words mean. So, you know, that's why it's super important to contextualize it. And so that we're all looking at the same scene and set of behaviors and answering based on that. So that's important. And in the harassment program, we have 134 diagnostic questions. And so it gets pretty nuanced just through that. But then combine that with, you know, in the program, people ask questions, and they know they're all anonymous. And what's so interesting is actually, we have a fair number of executives asking questions, which I find interesting. They're not comfortable, and when I see the nature of the questions, I understand, they're not comfortable asking their HR partners, their HR leaders. Like, so for example, we get, you know, what I'll call the, you know, the question of like, why do I need to include, you know, the woman to my golf outings question? I get that in all types of forms. I mean, it's golf, it's, you know, drinks, it's like whatever the, you know, the mode is, but it's the same kind of essence. And you know, that person's an executive, you know, just based on the way they're asking it. And they are too embarrassed to ask their HR partners, which is usually kind of an indication that they already know what the answer is. But you know, it's helpful because for us, it's no judgment, right? Like the key to evolving everyone's skills, and again, these are workplace skills, these are muscles, right? So the key to developing these muscles is you can't have judgment. So, you know, you got to be as neutral and as supportive as possible to lead them down the path so that they can see how someone else is experiencing things.
I know we had a huge paradigm shift when the Me Too movement really gained steam a couple of years ago. And I think that it prompted a lot of companies to run diagnostic types of tests like this, in addition to the mandatory harassment training that they had to do. And I have to believe that now is going to be another inflection point of a type we don't really know, particularly because we are working remotely. And again, as I said, you can't really see what everybody's doing. So I think a lot of behavior is going to kind of go flying under the radar. So what plans do you have to maybe change the types of questions that you're asking or change the way that you're working with companies during this time?
You know, it's a good question. I think I don't see a big change, only because our solution has been online. It's been designed to be, in some respects, it's an employee first solution, right? So it's an enterprise solution, but it's built and designed to be a great experience for the individual. And so, you know, what I see, I mean, we just launched a big, you know, organization with 75,000 employees. And I've been delighted about how many, you know, these employees are asking questions, individual questions, right? And they know it's de-identified. We don't see who they are. So I think our solution, you know, luckily was, you know, kind of kind of a nice solution for the time that we're in. You know, and when you look at, again, going back to my comment that your ethics, which is basically your code of conduct program, your respect, which is basically your harassment program, and your inclusion, which is basically, you know, our diversity program, those are kind of the three central pillars, right? So in our code of conduct program, for example, the diagnostic there, the pre-indicators that everyone should be looking at for are your systems for making decisions, right? Because all of us are basically reactive. Like, so Lydia, your comment where we've got that reptilian brain, right? So the way to counterbalance that reptilian brain is just a good system, the checklist. Like, I'm not going to react. I'm not going to make a decision right now. You need to have a good system. Trust, accountability, and then lastly, your norms and behaviors. You know, do you have established norms and behaviors? Because really quickly, when we flesh that out, to the extent that an organization does not have established norms and behaviors, let me tell you, there is a culture, and we all know this, there is a culture. It's just not one that you design proactively. It's the vacuum that allows usually the worst person's kind of behaviors to fill that vacuum, and that becomes your culture, right? So that's why that last one is so key.
I want to make sure we have enough time for the wonderful people who took the time to write in and ask some questions. And one of them actually is a good segue to what you were just talking about. Jenny asks, oh, she is actually keen for examples of the strong norms you saw most frequently in the healthy companies.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so examples of strong norms, I'll just give you a couple of illustrations. So the companies that are on the right side of our spectrum, which is where you want to be, the healthy side, typically would be organizations where people, the cultural leaders have done a lot of good work to instill the ability for, you know, radical candor. People are just culturally, you know, comfortable and supported by saying what's on their mind, right? So that's one big strong norm. Power disparity. So, you know, organizations that have done a lot of good work, you know, this is leadership development work to get their leaders to understand and think through the implications of their power. It's not intuitive, really, for the leader. Like, your leader thinks, and we actually have a scene, a video that we shot, where it just shows, you know, the leader is thinking when you're not at work, it's like, oh, we're all the same. No, you're not the same. You actually have power over this whole group of people, and you should always remember that. Remember that they're thinking about that, right? So that's just a leadership development of those leaders, so they kind of think through that. And then, you know, certainly those organizations where inclusion is just woven into their culture. Like, it's how we do business here, right? And so when you have some of these strong norms, you could come to that company being as biased as you want, being as, like, you know, passive aggressive and not candid and not honest as you want. But because that company has such strong established norms, you track to those norms, so that you leave your biases at the door. You are radically candid because that's how everyone else is acting. And you just map to, you know, the throughput line.
Here's another question that sort of is a nice segue into what you were talking about biases. This person wants to know how your diagnostic and analysis includes race and equity, not diversity and inclusion impacts. So the race and equity impacts.
So we're not tracking race, at least not now. I think we see it in our roadmap of, you know, a voluntary self-identification. But Lydia, you and I were talking offline, and I want to mention it here because this was one of my more disturbing aha moments. And I think this is something that we all need. We just need to kind of understand. So what we are tracking is what you know, I referenced as in-group, out-group, right? And so 32% of our data set, of our employee set, you know, self-identified as out-group, you know, employees, basically. So we can use our imagination to think about what could be an out-group, because we don't have it exactly. You know, they haven't identified themselves. But I just know from my, you know, 20 plus years as employment litigator, gender and race, there you go. Those are the out-groups usually in the power structure. And what was so disturbing was that we did a series of video scenes, and there would be an in-group person and an out-group person. And here's what we found. So when something bad happens to an out-group person, this whole data set, 2.5 million employee responses, said, oh, that wasn't that bad. And they didn't characterize it correctly as harassment. Or like, because we have a color coding spectrum, like we don't want to castigate and say harassment, but it should be orange or red, right? No. Oh, no, it's kind of yellow. Conversely, when somebody who's an in-group person, right, does something super disrespectful, like, oh gosh, did they really do that? And it's like a video scene, so we're all watching the same thing. Everyone said, oh, they meant well, and gave them a pass. And you know, for somebody who's been working on these issues like really my whole career, and I used to fight for employers race discrimination lawsuits. I mean, you know, I can't tell you how many lawsuits I defended. And this is not discrimination, because that has to rise to a different, you know, kind of standard. But this is the beginnings. These are the cancer. These are the early cancer cells, right? And you know what this showed me was, oh, people really are having a second-class experience. We are not all equal. Sorry, that's kind of a demoralizing downer.
No. We'll give you an opportunity to end on a hopeful note. I'll get you there. Another couple of questions run on a similar theme, which is kind of what we talked about the trickle-down effect with, you know, when that bad behavior is coming from the top. One specifically said how to handle it when a CEO is running a company into the ground and won't listen to anyone. His ideas, very short-sighted, are the best, and the board is made up of his friends. I would love to know how to enable the COO to gain courage to help avoid another. Another said that, how do you effectively shift a culture when the CEO does not believe there is a problem?
Yeah, so awesome. So business leaders reacted to data, to metrics, right? We guide, myself included, we guide our businesses through metrics. So you've got a sales metrics, you've got marketing metrics, you've got engineering sprints, which are metrics. Everything's metrics. The one thing that has been so horrific for this function, I mean, it's just such a you know, kind of a rough spot to be in. You've got so many smart people that are trying to do the right thing and try to be business advisors, and they have no metrics of like the most important things. So they have metrics of retention and metrics of recruitment power. But when I started drilling down and actually asking my buddies who are general counsel and HR leaders, hey, do you actually have metrics of how many claims turn into how many investigations, turn into how many lawsuits, turn into how many dollars? It's amazing. Public companies are not tracking this. So sorry, I'm kind of going off on a tangent, but going back to the matter at hand, you know, having an actual report that shows, I don't care, CEO, what you think, here's what your workforce thinks. And here's where the vulnerabilities are. And now you're informed with data. So make your decision based on the data. Oh, so Lydia, I can't hear you.
Better now?
Oh, yeah, better.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the previous question because they had a follow-up, and I want to make sure that we address it because it is an important issue. And they say it's an important issue, not an indictment, as it happens often. What led to the decision for Emtrain not to track by race and sex demographics?
So great question. I think we will. So this was, let me just back up a little bit because I think this is kind of, you know, I think it's kind of a fun, interesting story. So we're a bootstrapped organization, right? Or have been until recently. And I have just been so frustrated about the lack of a real solution in these areas that I care about, you know, that I've been spending my whole career on, that I finally said, I'm just going to take a leap of faith. I took out this, big multi-million-dollar loan to bring on a product and engineering team to actually do justice to these issues, because the rest of the compliance companies, no one's got really a product-driven solution to this. So, we started creating a brand new solution in the fall of 2017. We launched it in the spring of 2019, and it's our first rev. So, at that time, I've been kind of constrained by the confines of a compliance training solution, because frankly, even though it's a $5 billion a year spend just in America, Lydia, you'll appreciate this. I mean, everyone says, oh, they're stupid. No one expects to get any value out of them. And I've been trying to actually provide value within the confines of a compliance training solution. So there was only so much that we could do in terms of pushing the boundaries and people's comfort levels, because we still have customers that come to us and they say, we love your content. I mean, Netflix loves our content. So like, we got great content, but like this information, this data, it's really scary. We don't want it. And then I'll say, well, okay, then maybe you just need a poster tacked up against the break room. Maybe that's all you want. And some companies will say, yeah, that's all we want. We really don't want to have a dialogue. We just want to have a CYA. And so we still have a pretty big portion of the industry that feels most comfortable with frankly, a CYA. So we are, gently, as much as I can be gentle, gently trying to move the market to actually be more strategic and actually to solve these problems. So to answer that person's question, we absolutely will, in the next iteration of our product, have the ability to have a self-identify. And what I am really encouraged by is that just based on the voluntary questions and answers, I think if people trust that we really are de-identifying this and everyone's safe, that they will, be comfortable to identify their race and their gender.
This should be a really quick one. What are your thoughts on employee surveys that are not anonymous?
I think they're useless. So how's that? I mean, I just, people, I mean, and most of my friends are HR leaders. And so I have, some sympathy, like they're fighting the good fight and they're thinking that they're doing such great things, but please, I mean, you're off in an ivory tower and you're not in the trenches. And the bottom line is, whether you want to hear it or not, people don't want to talk to you.
Thank you for that. No, that's fine. I want to try to make sure that we have enough time for as many questions as possible. So I'm going to lump the next three together, and I want to frame it as more of a clarifying, because I'm seeing questions that are asking, our company has a bias where people went to college. What advice do you have against ageism? Any advice for employees over 50? And I want you to clarify what the tool does versus what you're not providing.
Yeah, it's very good. So the tool is basically, a compliance training solution, your anti-harassment training, your code of conduct training, your inclusion and belonging, diversity training. So it presents as a training program, online training program, but within that experience and as contextualized or anchored by video scenes showing, we try to show, current events basically. So, they're in the news. Then we ask people's opinions and their perceptions of what's going on in their workplace, in their teams, right? And as kind of an innocuous and gentle as a manner as possible. So for example, we have a scene where it's the manager not understanding the implications of that person's power, on a subordinate employee. And the subordinate employee feels kind of, forced to say yes and do something. And so then you all watch that and you say, okay, so, how comfortable do you feel that your managers understand the implications of their power in your workplace, in your team? You're strongly comfortable, strongly uncomfortable, right? And so we'll get reads from different parts. I mean, we basically do a heat map of the organization.
here's-
Let me just flesh that out. So I would say though, if there are biases based on educational backgrounds or ageism or what have you, it does show up. It would show up in the in-group, out-group, because we have a open text kind of interaction where we ask people to identify what they see as the in-group and out-groups. And so it's a word cloud that the stakeholder sees, which is really kind of interesting.
Right, and then just on top of that, as I said, there was yet another question that was similarly asking what to do. In this case, it's an HR person who is part of a company recently impacted by layoffs. How do we start rebuilding the culture while morale is low? Is there a company you know in a similar situation that we could look to for inspiration? And before you answer that, I just want to make it clear to the attendees what Emtrain's capabilities are versus what you're actually asking Janine to do.
Yeah, so again, we're what you see, I think about us like us as an iceberg, right? So there's what you see above the waterline and what exists below the waterline. So what you see above the waterline is an online culture education is kind of how I think of it, solution. And then it comes with data and analytics about what's going on in your workplace, and that's what's below the waterline. But certainly, I think, many organizations right now are facing demoralization. I mean, even if your organization is relatively fine weathering the storm, just watching all of your friends and colleagues around you is disheartening, right? So I don't think it makes a difference what industry you're in or how severely you're impacted by the current economic situation and health situation. This is a time for leadership, and this is a time for so to answer that person's question, you just need to proactively lean in, work with your C-suite, get a plan together, and a lot of it is communications and actions. You got to communicate, over communicate, but follow it up with actions, and people will understand. People will understand that the C-suite is completely busy right now. I mean, they're managing cash, they're managing rough road, right? So they need to really rely on the HR leader. And Steve Cadigan and I just did a LinkedIn live video discussion on this 2 weeks ago, which you can see on our website, because Steve, who's the former VP of talent at LinkedIn when they grew exponentially, he had some thoughts on this, on how the HR talent leaders can really step up to the plate and be the strong business advisor to the C-suite while frankly, they're just going to be preoccupied with, kind of emergencies.
So that is all the time that we have. I'm going to invite Steve to come back, but I did want to say, for those of you who did not get your questions answered, you could find Janine on LinkedIn, I'm sure, and drop her a line, and she can send you more information about Emtrain. You're certainly welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn, although I've gotten a number of requests to give people jobs since the last webinar, and I am not in a position to hire. I love you all though, and I wish you all the best of luck. And now over to Steve.
Lydia, can I butt in really quickly? Just, I think it would be helpful for people to know we've got our culture report and all these analytics on our website. So people are free to go to our website under the resources page. And if they want to do basically a simulation of what I've been discussing, they can do it on their own free. We've got a whole YouTube channel. So you can do the videos and you can ask the diagnostic questions that are reflected in our culture report. So you can kind of do a manual version of what our solution does if they want.
Oh, great. Well, thank you, Lydia and Janine. That was a great conversation, really timely. Thanks again to Emtrain and to all of you for participating today. If you'd like to join us for more virtual events, you can head to our website, fromday1.co, and check out more of our upcoming webinars. Next week at the same day, same time, same channel, we'll be looking at the future of work. Where will we be a year from now? So thanks very much, everyone. Be well.
Thank you, everyone.